What is up and welcome into the quick crash course on the Vienna Gambit. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov and today I'll walk you through the entire system so that you know how to play it successfully. It begins with you playing knight to c3, notice not the kingside knight because you want to leave the space for this pawn to be moved forward. And this is what you do right on the next turn. Now you're hitting his center, reconfirming the ancient chess wisdom, everyone's got a plan until they get punched by the f-pawn. And right now, your opponent is already kind of in trouble, because he can't just play common sense moves. Now, let me first show you what could easily happen if your opponent tries just developing pieces and castling. Of course, we'll talk about main lines in a moment just as well. But let's say your opponent plays similarly normal move, just developing a knight. Notice that we trade in the middle of the board, and then you hit the central pawn forward while attacking his knight. And wherever it goes, let's say it goes back, then you keep pushing pawn to e5, and that is another very common issue that black is facing here against the Vienna Gambit. The knight has no good squares to go to. It cannot go this way because of white's queen, and the knight cannot go in the middle of the board because of your knight. Therefore, this pawn pushes the knight all the way back to its original square, which is of course very sad because black just wasted time horsing around, achieving nothing. And now after you go knight to f3, and then after again black tries potentially to get rid of this pawn so that he can finally bring the knight back into play, you play a bishop to c4. And that is the other idea behind the Vienna Gambit. Since you've opened this f-file and you're about to castle there, we're also having this bishop putting pressure and potentially even our knight jumping forward, putting pressure right here. You see where it's going. Black is about to be in trouble. Of course, many of your opponents will wish to pin the knight so that it can't come forward as easily. But after you castle, and your opponent captures the pawn on a5, expecting you to recapture, here comes the first unpleasant surprise, a big bang. Bishop takes f7. Calling the king out, and then you continue with a knight taking on e5. Now we've got a pretty interesting situation. Ideally, this bishop would wish to capture the queen, but it can't because currently the knight attacks the king. So black would wish to take the knight, but they can't do that because here we've got this rook just standing right here and laughing because it takes aim at the king as well. Overall, things are pretty complicated, but it boils down to the fact that there is a double check right here to the king. The king has to go back, and now you pick up this bishop on g4. Now you're totally winning. The king is exposed. Knight is coming to f7 with all these attacks, and you're just winning. An ancient Greek philosopher Socrates famously said, "I know that I know nothing." And by using the Vienna Gambit, you force your opponent to come to the same realization right on the third move. Because right now, your opponent is already confused out of his opening prep. And the simplest solution to this problem seems to be just capturing that pawn on f4, but that is a common problem for black, a common mistake. Because you push the pawn forward, chase away this knight, and as we already know, it has no good squares to go to, because all the forward squares are already controlled by you. Therefore, the knight would wish to be retreated all the way back to g8. But of course, it's quite a sad reality. It's just come back to where it all started. Therefore, some of your opponents will try to pin the pawn instead and attack it simultaneously. But to this, you have a very standard response, just a symmetric move queen e2, which unpins the pawn and renews the threat to the knight. Finally, the knight is pushed all the way back. And then you play knight to f3, which is a nice development move, but also just in case you're controlling this square so that his queen can never jump forward and deliver this check to your king. Alright, then your opponent does something, you go pawn to d4, grabbing the space in the middle of the board, potentially threatening to push this pawn forward and to chase away this knight. But on top of that, you're also opening this diagonal for your bishop so that you can pick up that pawn on f4. And life is already good. Black is kind of oppressed. It's very hard to develop anyhow, to develop this knight or develop the bishop, it all kind of stuck. They'll usually play pawn to d6, offering you to trade pawns and maybe even hoping to trade queens, which of course would be really good for black, but instead you jump forward with the knight, forking the queen and also this pawn on c7, which black needs to keep guarding, therefore the queen will need to come here or here so that it keeps guarding the pawn, but in both cases your knight will bravely come forward with this check. This knight is really a forkaholic, deserves a promotion, but unfortunately gets eliminated. That's life. Now, after pawn takes d6, here there's a funny situation where black would wish to capture this pawn back, but they really can't because of this discovered check, which means that they're going to lose the queen. Alright, how about your pawn captures the pawn, but then simply retreats the knight all the way back to g8. Now, of course, that's great for you because your opponent achieved remarkably nothing, and then you continue with knight to f3, as always, also keeping an eye on this square just in case, and after that, pawn to d4, all the usual stuff, grab in the center, opening up your dark square bishop, getting ready to get this pawn back on f4, life's good. And if black captures on e5, of course, you could just recapture, but your lead in development is so huge right now, black is very methodical in ignoring development, that it makes sense for you to play in style of Morphy and Tal, and just to play for quick development and attack. Normally you develop your bishop right here to keep an eye on that weak pawn on f7, but it makes sense to first throw that intermediate check, and after your opponent blocks the diagonal, then you retreat back to c4. And what you achieve with this intermediate check is this pawn has moved to c6, and now the knight cannot go there anymore because it's blocked by his own pawn, which makes it even harder for black to anyhow complete his development in this game. But of course, also knight takes e5 is coming, threatening this pawn. Something like bishop to g4 will always run into this check once again. We have seen this idea before as well. There are really a lot of tactics right here. And if your opponent captures this pawn, hoping for you to finally recapture and trade pieces off, you can ignore this safely and again just go for this all-out attack. Now the pawn is hanging, and if he happily grabs your knight, hoping for an exchange of queens, you're saying, I'm not going to exchange, I'm going to win it for nothing. Bishop takes f7 once again, but this time the idea is different. You want to deflect the king, and if the king captures the bishop, that's going to drop the queen on d8. Therefore, the king needs to move in such a way where it would keep defending that queen on d8. But now the king is exposed, and you're just going after it directly. Queen e2 check, king captures the bishop, now knight takes c5, we keep chasing the king. And now where can it go? It can't really go to the e-file because of this discovered attack. Check to the king and to the queen as well, right? Therefore, the king needs to do something else. The king cannot go here. No, not here. I meant here because of our knight. And the final square which is left is this square on f6. But then you've got another brilliant follow-up, bishop g5. You're sacrificing the bishop to push the king right here, and then you finish the game with this nightmare. Another question that comes to mind is, can black avoid all these traps by simply playing d6 and defending his central pawn? Well, kinda yes, temporarily, but the issue is the move is very passive. It blocks the bishop, it does not try to attack you or to gain this pawn on f4, and therefore after that you can just keep attacking, and black is still trying to barely hold his position. Bishop b5 pins the knight, bishop d7 neutralizes the pin, but now after d3 you have something which is very similar to the classical Italian game or Rui Lopez, but you've got this pawn on f4, which is quite a big asset, because if you imagine a staring position with the pawn being right there, the position is a little bit dull. It's quite hard to attack. But with the pawn on f4, you've got much more options. It's like once you've castled, you've got the rook right here, putting pressure. The pawn can be pushed forward so that you gain space on the king side and attack there, and we'll see later how you can make use of that. And also you're putting pressure right here. And the fun fact about this position is that two most common moves of black are a6 and bishop e7, and both of them just blunder the fact that this pawn on e5 was actually undefended. You can first trade off this knight on c6 and then capture the pawn on e5, which is no longer defended. Now you simply won this pawn. Moreover, on the next turn you can also capture on c6 and ruin his pawn structure on the queen side as well. And now you've got a lot of positional advantages. You're up a pawn, you've got a really nice pawn structure here in the middle of the board, while black got a bunch of weaknesses. You've got this semi-open file for your rook and this diagonal for your bishop. Life is really great and you should be winning here. By the way, if you're not sure how to convert such positions into a guaranteed victory, I've got a free masterclass about that. I'll drop the link down below so that you can check it out later. Besides developing their kingside knight, your opponents could also develop the queenside knight to c6. And in this case, I would actually not recommend that you play f4 right away. It is generally speaking perfectly playable and you can do that, but it's somewhat a little bit less effective, and I think there is an easier way. So here's the issue: when you play f4 right here, after black captures, there is no idea of pushing the pawn forward and chasing away this knight from f6 because there is no knight right there, right? So that's the downside. And plus now you gotta be careful with queen h4, check to your king. Again, of course you could stop that, nothing wrong with that, but it's just more complicated. And I think it's easier for white to start with the move bishop c4, and then on the next turn pawn to d3, and we're simply preparing this advancement pawn to f4, and therefore instead of playing it earlier where it was slightly risky, now you play it when your position is rock solid in the middle of the board, and also it's not even a gambit. The pawn is protected by the bishop, therefore if black captures it, no problem, that only helps you develop your bishop and achieve a great position with advantage in the middle of the board. If black goes pawn to d6, again, there are different ways to go about this. You could just play knight f3, perfectly fine, but I love the move f5 because practically I noticed that most of your opponents have no idea how to handle that, and they usually find themselves in a losing position because it's extremely difficult for black to defend here properly. And if they simply castle, that leads to a very interesting situation where only 7 moves into the game, black played all very standard opening moves, and they found themselves in a lost position. How come? That's how tricky the Vienna Gambit is. Now, thanks to this pin, we're putting pressure on the king side and his king. You're bound to jump this knight forward, capitalizing on the pin and also disrupting the pawn cover of his king. Because of your pawn on f5, they cannot bring the light square bishop out because of this pawn that took away all these squares and shut it down this diagonal altogether. And that is why black is kind of lost. There's nothing they can do really, and you are about to play knight d5, use the pin to open up his king position and to attack. For example, if they try pawn to h6 to attack the bishop, again, you could just retreat back, but h4 is even a little bit more fun. You're using that fish and pole trap, where if the bishop is captured, and again, if not, you just keep attacking yourself. If bishop is captured, after this recapture, black is facing the usual issue. The knight has no squares forward to go to, because your queen controls them. And if the knight goes back instead, somewhere here or here, does not even matter. In both cases, you're going to play queen to h5. That comes back to our usual quote, don't judge a rook by its cover. Somehow this rook on h1, even though it played no moves in this game, but it became that decisive attacking force. And now we're threatening the knight, and if the knight comes, then queen to h8 is a checkmate. Now let's talk about the fish in the room. Comp says that black actually should play knight to f6, but after f4, black should not defend this pawn or capture on f4. Both of those moves are wrong. We've been talking about that already. The right move for black is d5, a very counterintuitive counter-strike in the middle of the board. Luckily for you, only advanced players play that, and if I remember it correctly, only about 20% of players only play this correct move, meaning 80% will use an inferior option instead. And now after d5, black's idea is if you capture this pawn on e5, they're going to recapture this pawn on e4. And definitely this is much better for black compared to previous lines where they had to retreat the knight back to g8. So knight takes e4, what are you going to do now? First off, the nice thing about the Vienna Gambit is that it is solid. Even this position is still equal after black found that correct response early in an opening. Now, you do not want to take this knight on e4. Now, for the OGs, you know that to take is a mistake, and this general rule applies for this position as well. Avoid unmotivated exchanges. It usually only helps your opponent, and this is not an exception. It only helps this pawn to come forward and to take away this vital f3 square from your knight. Therefore, you will be unable to develop it anymore. Therefore, we do not take on e4. Instead, you can just get rid of this knight and play queen to f3. This way, you're putting pressure to the knight, trying to force black to trade the knight on c3. Now, we'll talk about this line in a moment, but before that, let me quickly tell you one trap that your opponent can try on you. This is the move knight to c6, where initially it kind of looks like they maybe overlooked the fact that you can capture this knight on e4, but that is not the way to go. The way to go, just as a quick spoiler, is to play bishop b5. You're pinning this knight so that it cannot move, and after that black will be forced to do something once again about this knight on e4, and that'll come back to pretty much usual variations, which we'll talk about that. But for now, once again, let me just show you the trap that your opponent may be hoping for. If you take on e4, expecting your opponent to recapture, they instead have a very powerful in-between move knight to d4. With this double attack to your queen and pawn, and if white is trying to hold on to the defense of all that, and then after an exchange, black's got another powerful follow-up, bishop to f5, threatening the queen, and once the queen moves anywhere, it doesn't really matter, the knight can jump forward to c2 with a check to the king and attack off the rook, and it's all pretty bad for white. That is a well-known trap. Some of your opponents may try this against you, but as we discussed, it's very easy to get rid of it. Just don't get greedy, and instead of taking this knight, go bishop b5, neutralize the knight, and life's good. In most cases, however, your opponents will play a much more natural move. They'll just trade off on c3. Now, both recaptures make sense. If you recapture with this pawn, then your idea would be to build up that really strong pawn chain in the center. And if your opponent goes whatever, I mean, objective position is about equal. But just so that you know how to proceed from here, I'll show you what the plan is. Ideally speaking, you want to build up this rock-solid pawn chain in the middle of the board. And that also shows why knight to c6 was actually wrong by black, because now his own knight blocks the pawn from c7 and he can't go forward and attack your center anymore, which makes his opportunities for counterplay very limited. And otherwise, if your opponent feels that there is no issue, he just wants to continue his development first, then you do the same. But as a result of that, we get to the point where your central pawn chain is just very annoying. It gives you a lot of additional space. It also makes it harder for black to maneuver. You want to castle kingside. You've got two bishops pointing there. You've got this knight ready to jump forward to f4, potentially putting more pressure all around. And actually, black's position is very tough. If your opponent ever tries to undermine this pawn chain, hoping to maybe use this opposition of the rook and queen, then do not take there. Instead, you've got something much more interesting. Since this move also weakens the pawn shield of the king, you can rush into the attack with queen to h5, taking aim at this pawn and threatening checkmate. And for black, it's very hard to do anything against that. If they try pawn h6, you can sack the bishop right here to totally open up the king and finish it off within just a couple moves. Let's take that back. If instead your opponent tries moving the other pawn forward to also blockade this threat, then you're going to sack the other bishop. And also now the king is totally defenseless. There is a little bit of an issue for you is you cannot checkmate the king right away just because you don't have any other pieces besides this queen into the attack. Therefore, a better try for white is to simply castle first so that you can also use this rook lift and bring more pieces into the attack, and now black is indeed defenseless. Of course, you can also play bishop h6, queen h6, use this rook lift, maybe bring the knight into the attack, and you've got more than enough to finish the game. For example, if he offers an exchange of queens, of course we're not going to do that. You will continue attacking and then use this rook lift, not like this, and black is defenseless. You're going to checkmate black within a few moves. Maybe you got excited about the Vienna Gambit, went on to try this out, however found yourself playing black. What do you do then? Well, good news, you can actually use something very similar as black. In this case, if your opponent goes for the very standard Italian game, the most classical chess opening, you can play pawn to f5, known as the Rousseau Gambit. And this boy got me a lot of nice victories, especially in blitz. Even though, objectively speaking, it's a bit risky, but realistically your opponents usually don't really know how to proceed right here, and you can see that it is basically the Vienna Gambit with reversed color. Capturing this pawn f5 is still wrong for the reasons that we already know. You can push the pawn forward, chase this knight away. You will then also play d5 and gain one more tempo, hitting this bishop, get this pawn back, develop your pieces, and get a really nice attacking position. I've got a dedicated video about that. I'll put it right here so that you can check this out, and I'm sure you will enjoy it.